Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Tyler Yearby and Shawn Myszka about their new paper looking at an ecological approach to practice design in American football. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about a couple extra things that might interest you if you're enjoying the podcast. First, my book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills, is now available in audiobook format. You can find it on Audible or Amazon. Second, if you're interested in working directly with me, I currently have openings in my monthly mentorship program. This includes monthly Zoom meetings, either one-on-one or with your staff, analysis of your practice designs, and a monthly group discussion with coaches and instructors from a range of different sports. To find out more, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Now on to the show. Okay, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome back frequent visitors to the podcast, Shawn and Tyler from Emergence. We're all gathering here today because I wanted to talk about their really excellent paper they just had come out on an ecological approach to, I'm going to say it one time, American football. Between the three of us, I think we can safely just call it football, right? But we're talking about soccer. We're talking about American football. So congratulations, guys, on the paper. I think it's a really good, has a really thorough and covers a lot of different angles. The one, I guess, to start with, I wanted to get, where you were coming from in football. I find, I don't know if this is still true, but when people always ask me, how much is the ecological approach permeating different sports? I always use my main sport, baseball, as like it's going really well. And I always use American football as my example of where a lot of work needs to be done. Is that where you guys are starting from? Is it?
Rob, that's a great point. And I completely agree with you. I think in baseball, the ideas are being shared and they're being utilized quite nicely. I mean, it's still a work in progress, but American football, it's struggling. We're a bit behind. I feel as though there are a lot of coaches that are very receptive to the ideas, but putting them into practice or feeling comfortable with utilizing the ideas, we're not quite there yet. And, we're all in a self-education journey here and, gaining a better understanding of how we can utilize these ideas practice. But I think football is behind, although football is ripe for growth and being a sport that you can utilize a CLA in quite nicely, the importance clearly of representative learning design and the notion of what I like to term softly assembling practice tasks, something that aren't being done or is not being done in American football, is something that I think needs to be done in order for athletes to have autonomy and ownership and move in purposeful ways. So I'm excited for where the paper can potentially lead American football and potentially be a springboard for other sports as well.
Yeah. Shawn, I'll let you answer, but also, is there a general resistance to kind of sports science from outsiders as well in football? That's what I found a little bit when I've tried to work. Yeah,
I think that's accurate, Rob. And much to Tyler's point, it was the impetus for the reasoning behind the paper. It's why we felt, and obviously it's been an uphill battle for me since adopting the ecological approach now over 10 years ago within American football. That is the only sport I operate in or have operated in the last 15 years. So I've faced much of that resistance, but yet I've been on both sides of the fence, if you will, the more traditional approach early on, before realizing the true impact and power and influence of an ecological approach within my own craft and practice. So as I've tried to get these ideas to permeate American football, I have faced that resistance from all levels. I mean, a lot of it within American football, for the people who are listening out there, they might not realize that it's kind of this big good old boy network. It's we are what we repeatedly do, and we are what we've repeatedly done. And because we've always done it that way, that means we should continue to do it this way. The ideas just keep breeding upon themselves. And when one comes up those ranks, whether it's with playing or coaching, and that's what you've experienced, you really know no other way. And so part of the problem is that resistance that you just alluded to. That's why we see this highly decontextualized nature, or this really rote repetition type of approach, or a very coach-centered as opposed to an athlete-centered approach within the facilitation of these movement skills, where they're trying to get everyone to essentially behave in the same fashion. I mean, many of the things that obviously you've talked about now in your over 400 episodes here at Perception Action Podcast. So I think some of it has been the resistance, some of it is the tradition. And because of both of those things, you get, I hate to use the word ignorance here, you get an ignorance and an arrogance to be like, well, we're already achieving success. So why is it that we need to change either how we view what's emerging, or how it is that we attempt to facilitate more functional emergence of the movement skill? Like, we're already succeeding is kind of their perspective and their opinion.
Yeah. It seems like they're also, comparing it to baseball again. Baseball went through the shift a few years ago from so much emphasis on talent ID. Let's draft the right players, to talent development. Maybe this pitcher couldn't throw hard before, we can make him throw harder. I think football's still pretty behind in like, we got to pick the right players. Oh, that guy can't do this. They're already set in their ways. So that's really interesting. Do you think, so you mentioned it's kind of the old bulls. Is it kind of the nature of the sport too? And maybe Tyler, like, if you think about offense in football, people think of it being very scripted, everybody's told what to do. There's a lot of, which is not, we all know it's not. Is it part of that where everyone has to learn plays and the coaches give all the information? Is that part of the issue too?
It is part of the issue. Yeah. I mean, if you think about different levels, especially from like the Power 5 level in football here in the States, of course, up to the NFL, and then even into Canada and the CFL, they have huge playbooks. Now, that said, as you just mentioned, nothing ever unfolds exactly like it's scripted. I mean, matter of fact, it's usually very, very opposite than how it's scripted. And you have a lot of choice within that. And you have emergent decision-making that is occurring. And coaches will, a lot of times, they'll come down on their players for not behaving the way that they were told to behave, but yet they're not embedded in environments where they can actually behave in a way that's going to help them succeed as a team. So I think that that's part of the problem. And to answer your question, or to further the comments as far as the reason for the paper, there are clearly wonderful books that are out there. I mean, you just released an awesome new book that helps coaches understand like what they can utilize or ideas that they can harness within practice. There's tons of papers in baseball and rugby and basketball and futsal. And there's so many different sports that are out there. And yes, the ideas transcend sports in general, as we well know, with, emergence and self-organization properties of complex adaptive systems. That said, coaches generally like to see something in their sport. They want to know, like, I want to see a practical example of this being applied on a regular basis. Now, we ended up with 2 case examples. We had 5 in the paper. It probably doesn't come as any surprise to the listeners out there to know that Shawn and I not only talk a lot, but we write a lot as well. So we ended up removing 3 case examples and just expanded a little bit upon the other 2 to show how you can utilize, or how the CLA might be able to be harnessed and used within American football. That way, American football coaches look at it and go, okay, I see what they mean. I'm probably guilty of some of what they mentioned earlier in the paper. And then I need to now go about how I could potentially make changes within my practice that maybe takes it a little bit more in the direction of allowing for athletes to behave in a way to where they can then repeat that effort whenever they get into the game. So I think it's there where we need to take this. And that's why we put the paper together, because we wanted there to be something that has been published, whether it's paper or book form, that allows for coaches to then refer to and then potentially expand upon ourselves and others.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I get asked that all the time. can you give specific examples to my sport? It's so helpful when you work through, and you guys work through all the logic of it and how it connects to the ideas. And Shawn, I'm sure like football, some of the reason, maybe there's some unique considerations in football for some of this, right? Safety numbers that you have available. We can talk a little bit about that. Some of the challenges of implementing some of the constraints, like I know you've thought about, the effect of a helmet, the effect of pads, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. There are some interesting case examples that obviously have emerged over the last 10 plus years of me trying to incorporate or implement a constraints-led approach and really viewing movement behavior in this way. Typically, the resistance that I have found are some of those, let's just call them excuses that sometimes coaches come up with that, well, if we're going to be fully representative, why don't they just go play the game and it's 11v11? Hence the reason we circled the wagons in the paper around. It doesn't always have to be fully representative. It's about having the most, let's just call it relevant affordances present within the practice or learning or training environment that an athlete could become attuned and sensitive to make decisions around and obviously adapt their movement actions in relation to. And so if we look at some of those characteristics of American football, what we find is that, usually that big excuse that I get from position coaches, which is like, well, we don't know how to control for all these interacting component parts. So that's why we go from this progression of, and I use the word progression there deliberately and intentionally, because that's actually what they do. If you look at football practices, they're going from a indie period where it's just that position group and they're doing things in highly decontextualized nature, right? It's usually cone drills, agility drills. And for those listeners out there, I'm using air quotes. It's not true agility, right? They're just actually operating in a very rote repetition type of fashion where things are hyper controlled. And then they might go into some 1v1 type of actions, but it's not highly ecologically, let's just call it centered or valid in the way that they execute those 1v1 actions. And then they might do a little bit of half line and then they throw them right into the chaos of the game, the full 11v11, right? And it's, in my point to individuals are always this, that if we look at those respective constraints, no matter who it is that you are and what role you have, say for me in particular, as a movement skill acquisition coach for individual players, I might only have, say, 5 to 8, maybe 10 guys max out on a practice or training environment at any given one time. But yet you can still represent the key interactions. You can still offer and present the most specifying or relevant affordances that could potentially channel more functional, more efficacious, more integrated movement solutions. We can keep it coupled, if you will. We can still always keep perception and action coupled. So usually excuses, and I know that I'm rambling a bit, but usually the excuses that I get from position coaches is like, if I'm a wide receivers coach or if I'm a linebackers coach, I only have receivers or linebackers in my group. And Tyler and I, the thing that we've often presented to these position coaches is, number one, they're still living, moving bodies. Like you can still offer or present alive movement problems that require one to connect to relevant information sources that then allow for the authenticity and adaptability and degeneracy that we would want to see when they get into the game context. And if you are really kind of thinking outside the box, if you're an American football coach and you're a running backs coach or a wide receivers coach, you might be able to pair yourself in indie periods, say maybe with the linebackers or the defensive backs, and actually just take that unit and really create more emergent problems, more alive movement problems that would represent the game. But and I'll come to a close with this, some of the other things that you mentioned, such as safety, would you rather leave it to chance, or would you allow yourself to maybe bring that athlete or the athletes to their challenge point in a place where you can constrain, or at least constrain to afford and manipulate constraints accordingly to keep it safer, but to take that next step where you can stretch their grip over the field of affordances instead of just leaving it to chance that just says, we're never going to tackle in practice, or we're never going to move at these higher speeds, or we're not going to have all these interacting moving bodies. Like the more comfortable we can get with manipulating the constraints in efficacious ways while still keeping that safety in mind, helmets, pads, so on and so forth. Like all of that stuff impacts the perceptions and the intentions and the actions, and actually the true interactive nature between an alive movement problem in this organizational state of a mover.
Yeah. No, Shawn, I think there's some great points there. And I like the representative design issue. I think people get in their mind that representative design means recreating situations that you would occur in a game, a blitz or this. And they look at, I only have 6 players. How can I do that? It's recreating representative problems, right? Problems that share the sum of the same element. It doesn't have to be a situation that would ever occur in a real football game. I think that's a really key point. I think people don't, they look, how is that representative? Because it shares the same information, action, the key elements, right? Yeah. Tyler, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing. I think that's a perfect point as far as representing the problems that are going to emerge or likely could emerge on game day. But I wanted to pick up on the point of safety. So it's something that I thought about a lot when I first started. I shouldn't say first started, when I felt comfortable utilizing a CLA, because I did go back and forth for a while because I didn't exactly know if that's what I wanted to do. So I've talked about that before on podcasts, meaning it wasn't like it was just a quick flip for me. And all of a sudden I went from utilizing a traditional rote repetition technical model approach right to the CLA. It did take me some time where I was experimenting with the ideas. But my point being is I did think about what about the safety aspect? And there are 2 points that I'll mention here. One we touched upon already with regard to the helmet. If you think about the American football helmet, the helmet that's worn, there are bars in the front. There are going to be different variations, different amounts of bars that are there. That's going to not only distort in some ways the visual pickup of information, but also the auditory pickup of information. It's going to change the way that the human connects to the information and the specified affordances in the world around them. So I thought about that piece. And I know it's something that Shawn was actually utilizing far before I was, but I wanted to incorporate that into my practice design, because if I didn't, I felt as though the information they were going to be picking up might not be as representative as it would have been, or they wouldn't connect to it as a sensitive way if they weren't wearing it. So with regard to the safety piece, I feel as though having them wear their helmets while operating with autonomy was wildly important for their safety. That's number one. And I'm hoping that the listeners can see the connection between the two, because yes, they wear helmets whenever they're doing rote repetition, just redundant activities, but they're almost turned off at that point. They're not put in a position where they can increase upon the notion of skilled intentionality, where there's that selective openness and responsiveness to a landscape of affordances. I believe that was Keverson and Retfeld. But point being is that they are now embedded in that situation where they can connect to information that can specify how they can regulate their behaviors while utilizing a task constraint such as equipment. The other piece being this, and this was through just a lot of conversations. I want to say thousands, but at least hundreds of conversations, asking for an answer, but also watching the answer in the form of their action. And what I mean is this. So at the end of the day, I have a handful of questions that I'll go through with the athletes that I partner with. And one of them early on was, did the problems that you interacted with today, did they feel representative to you? Did the problems emerge in a similar way that you've encountered before in games? And the answers that I would get a lot of times from players are like, it seems the same to me, or I'm moving in a way that would be the same as I would move in the game. So I'm guessing the answer is yes. They hadn't even really thought about it. Mm-hmm. The answer that I was getting from their actions was, if we look at what Bernstein mentioned, no natural phenomenon can be understood without carefully considering how it emerged. I'm watching how their emergent behavior is in response to the problems that are occurring within sport, and their behaviors they had fidelity or action fidelity, to utilize Stoffergren's point of it looked, felt, and behaved like it would in the game itself. And so if that's the case, I feel as though it was close enough where they could still couple their movement to the information in a purposeful way that would be transferable to the sport, to where their actions would then be similar to what we would expect to see.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah, I like the asking the question and probing it and seeing it in their actions both.
Right.
I think that's a really important point. It made me think another kind of, I think, resistance maybe for football. Football is an incredibly physical sport. So I think it lends itself to the fundamentals idea, right? You got to get agility, strength, power, acceleration before we put you on the field. Like this kind of breaking it down. I think it's a natural, it lends itself to that as well. This separation of S&C and skill and all that kind of stuff we hammer on about. I think it gets into that naturally. You guys, before we get into the specific examples, maybe Tyler, I'll start with you. This next one. What are kind of the main of all the kind of basic principles of ecological approach, nonlinear pedagogy? What are the kind of the main ones that you kind of wanted to focus on? I know you touched on pretty much all of them, but if football really needs a lot of work, is it decision making? What are kind of the main ones you see?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. There are quite a few, but if I have to narrow it down, I think I'll start where you mentioned, where you left off there, like the idea of having the ability to make one's decision themselves. Mm-hmm. Now, why is that important? That's important because we perceive opportunities in the world around us based on our action capabilities. And so whether that be if someone can pass through a gap, whether that be with their body, or whether that's me throwing a ball between the gap, whether someone has tackle ability, all of those ideas are going to be interwoven with how I intend to act or how I aim to interact, one's intentions, the information that I'm picking up in the world, and then the actions that are tightly woven in that. So I think the ability to make decisions in context is key. So I have to include representative learning design. And then to the point that Shawn made earlier and that you reiterated, it doesn't have to be 11v11. Matter of fact, sometimes it's better if it's 3v5, 5v4. Why? Because we can constrain to afford, we can start to channel opportunities for action that we co-adaptively have created in order for them to engage with opportunities that might allow for them to move in more efficacious ways. Mm-hmm. So I think representative learning design is important. Clearly, the idea of utilizing constraints and manipulating them accordingly. I say accordingly, it's not just a random, I'm just going to try this today, even though that might have benefits sometimes. I think that idea is important. I try to appreciate just in general, if we're talking about complex systems and complex adaptive systems, the idea of nonlinearity in learning. And so when I look at practice designs or practice tasks that I've designed, I'm not walking off the field just completely frustrated if an athlete has a rougher day, meaning maybe they don't solve as many problems that day, because I may see the behavior start to change as they become sensitive to that information and they start to recalibrate their actions accordingly. So I want to include nonlinearity in that equation where exploratory learning can exist. I mean, that's the idea or part of the idea of nonlinear pedagogy to begin with, but I want that to occur. So I would say representative learning design, the constraints-led approach, the idea of emergent decision-making, which is tantamount in a lot of ways to movement problem solving in sport. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, those are key pillars for me. And then the other part, and this is harnessed within that. And I finished my last comment saying, like, the idea of safety. One thing that I failed to mention is that the activities that we utilize very, very, very seldomly was there a lot of really hard contact at the very, very end of the activities, meaning that they're actually tackling them and going to the ground. More often than not, that's not the case. Now, that's not to say that they aren't converging in a manner that is going to be similar to what they would encounter within the sport. That was my point. But that also doesn't mean that we weren't having physicality exist within the problems that we were setting up. So if we think about the idea of representative learning design, well, if we're going to utilize that idea, we have to incorporate the ability for them to pick up information similar to what they would in the game, meaning that they're going to need to pick up haptic information. So there's going to be contact to start some of the activities, and then they're continuing to solve problems as they go. So I'll finish there. I imagine I left plenty for Shawn to add.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there and simply say that the biggest things for me, because I have battled for so many years with American football coaches and the relevance, the true worth and the nature of many of these ecological dynamics oriented ideas, is number one, to be able to truly analyze movement behaviors that are emerging in context. So we wanted to capture that. And in capturing that, we wanted to be able to really bring people to an ecological approach to get them to recognize the true scope or scale of analysis between the performer and the environment relationship, or that mutual reciprocal nature between those two. And it's there that I think we can start to place this discussion of analyzing the movement behaviors or attempting to quote unquote acquire movement skills to emerge there, acquire and or adapt movement skills to emerge there, based on this respect towards the movement problem. And that movement problem, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but I want to circle the wagon once again on a focus that at least I had, and I know that the whole team had as we approached the writing of this paper, oriented around the aliveness of the problem and this mutual reciprocal exchange between that problem and the way that the player was behaving within it. Mm-hmm. So I think that hopefully was reflected within both case studies, as well as the way that we discussed or unpacked many of the theories that are important, near and dear to us. Because I think there we start to see some of this layered information movement coupling. We start to see some of like the authenticity and the creativity and the novelty that may emerge within that movement problem solving process. We keep that movement problem solving process highly coupled in its perception and action always being intertwined and interwoven. And really what we tried to do is implore football coaches to think about all movement behavior on a football field in that fashion. And I know that that's still an uphill battle. Like we still have a lot of work to be done to help inform them as to how to best do that. But if I'm speaking selfishly, I know that that was a major box that I wanted to be able to tick when all was said and done and this paper was published.
Yeah. No, I think you did a really good job of that. If you haven't played football at all, you don't realize how, like I played in high school too, on the line, like you're 1 foot from someone else, but there's so much interaction and information happening in that tiny space so quickly. You're right, haptic information, and it's a dance almost that's happening. Yeah. Maybe we can jump to the your examples, your case studies. Do you want to? Is there a particular, Tyler? Do you want to start with one of the ones in particular?
Yeah,
just kind of have a rough, idea of what. Yeah, because I think this is what people really like you said at the start, how you actually put it in practice.
That's actually, I guess, a lion's share of the feedback thus far is, we really enjoyed the first part of the paper, but I really like the case examples. You guys should have included more. I'm like, oh, we tried to. Yeah. We had it's 8,300 words, for goodness sakes. We had a word count. It was like 12,000 words initially. Yeah. No, I think I'll start with the second case example. I mean, for those of you it's all written by the five of us. It's not like that it was like all my words. Now it's my application of the ideas that is then shaped amongst the authorship team. So I want to give credit where credit's due as far as Keith and Carl and Will having their hand in the writing of this paper as well, because they were wildly important. But as far as the second case example, it's with the high school football players here in the U.S. and a group of guys, actually quite a few that I've worked with for some time that are now off playing, a lot of them in college. But we wanted to offer something that was different than an all-pro NFL example, which is what the first case example is about. One that, somebody that Shawn has worked with for actually probably a decade or more at this point. So we wanted to offer one that way coaches could see, like, this isn't just for high level athletes, nor is it for just Pee Wee football players. It's for the entire spectrum. So we also wanted to offer the high school example because a good majority of the time, there were a number of players from the same team that were out there. So that's important because coaches that say, well, I have too many players. Oh my goodness, I wish I had too many players. Yeah. I wish I had the ability to utilize a different body, which is going to present a different problem, which is going to channel a different affordance for, said solver. So I think that it's important to recognize that a case example that offers or has at least multiple athletes in the same team is important. So that with the second one, it was centered around the linebacker position. So for those of you that aren't familiar with football, the linebacker is going to be the second line of defense, if you will. Generally 3 of them, not in all defenses, but there's generally going to be two outside backers and a middle backer. The middle backer is the, let's call it captain sometimes of the defense, which doesn't mean that they're telling everybody how to behave, but they're at least maybe the sounding board for the communication of the defense. And so it was working with several different linebackers, but two in particular, where I fortunately had an opportunity to watch them play in person because they're from a local high school here in the Twin Cities, as well as see a ton of film on them. And it was identifying that their strengths. That way we could continue to explore, allow them to exploit those in situ. But as importantly, looking at what opportunities exist there. What might they be missing on the affordance landscape that could allow them to move in more functional ways? So it was a lot of tinkering. Those of you who have heard me speak before, I am a massive proponent of representative co-design. So I lean into my athletes to help design activities that are going to be something that maybe is going to meet them where they are that day. That way they are being challenged in a way that's going to allow them to continue to adapt because skills are not static. So that's what that was centered around. I offered a lot of specific manipulation, but it was centered around the ability to make tackles in open space. So that's going to be near the numbers or out in open space where we're away from the line. You're generally going to have high velocities at that point, which is going to mean large collisions. The angles are going to change quite substantially. So an athlete's going to need to pick up the relative velocity someone's moving at, the bearing angle that they're moving. There's likely going to be levels to the problem, meaning that, the affordances that are emerging or are emerging because of not only the player that's in front of me at that time, potentially who's to the side, who's behind that individual. So I may move in a way that allows for me to solve that problem and potentially one thereafter. So I can expand even more so, but centered around linebackers making tackles in open space. It was a largely driven rep without rep approach. So we were changing the interpersonal distances to start the activities, the directions they were facing, the speed they were moving into the problem. And that part's crucial because a lot of times whenever I see coaches that are trying to utilize these ideas, they're starting with the same speed or the same player on a regular basis. Well, moving at a different speed is going to afford me to move in different ways because of it. And so I want to highlight that point. And then having different surfaces, changing the time of practice based on what time they were going to be playing and the surface in which they were going to be playing on. Mm-hmm. Now, why might I do that? And I'll wrap up with this, and I can expand if you need me to, but why might I do that as far as changing the time of practice when I can? Well, that's going to change the temperature. That's going to change the light. That's going to change the way in which they can move because of the light that they're picking up or the opportunities they're picking up, or the surface underneath their feet is going to be either more grabbable or allow for better footing because there's either no moisture or there is moisture. All of that's going to change the way that they can move in that particular space. So those are just a couple of things that we did and the reason behind the design for the case example.
Yeah, Tyler, I like that. There's some really key points in there for me. Sometimes when people ask for examples, I worry because what they seem to be asking for is a set of alternative drills. And clearly you're not doing, there's not one or even 10 ecological ways to coach a linebacker. All the factors you mentioned, you could combine those in 1,000 different ways, right? So it's more about the principles of applying it rather than here's a new set of methods. I think that's what I think is really critical to me, that you get that message across. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I love the way that you packaged that there because yes, it was for the linebackers in that particular situation, but that could be used for any number of players on the field. It's the principles that are going to underpin why they manipulate what constraints they're manipulating. Yeah. And it's important to notice that, it's stated there in the paper, but we initially designed the activity because the player was missing, and we feel as though just through conversation and through the actions that were emerging, missing an opportunity to maybe make the tackle a bit sooner, or they weren't picking up the information as quickly as we feel as though they could have picked it up. So it wasn't that they weren't fast enough to get there. Matter of fact, that two athletes I'm referring to are very fast athletes, but it was the football speed we were looking to increase. And What does that mean? That means the complete movement problem solving process. That means someone's sensitivity to the relevant information that's going to specify how they can act. And in their ability to act in that way is going to be largely dependent on them being embedded in this situation where they've been able to go through the process of solving those alive problems over and over again, which is going to allow for them to have a greater movement skill toolbox.
Yeah, that's the other thing I really liked about your constraints-led approach is a purposeful manipulation of constraints based on where the athlete is currently in the solution space, right? It's not just throwing random junk at them, like just so they have to adapt. It's purposeful. You have to understand what they're doing now, right? And opportunities are missing, and right. So that's where the real coaching skill comes in, right? Anybody could just go manipulate the number of players in the field, right? You have to see like they're not closing down. Yeah, I love the football speed too. That was yeah.
That was inspired, I will say, and just real quick, and then Shawn, I'll let you jump in here. Whenever we first spoke with the other three authors, and they were just like, there's so much that's here, and they were kind of offering different suggestions. And that was really born out of one of the very first conversations that we had. And it was, look, you guys are describing a different type of speed, because going back to a point you made earlier with, unfortunately, how football views the importance of speed. They view it as an entirely different speed. It's, this guy runs a 4.240. That's fantastic. He can't tackle anybody, nor can he catch a football. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
And also, as he's catching the football, he's turning his head, which is changing the way in which he's going to move. So that speed he had is only so important. So we're not saying it's not valuable for someone to be fast, but they need to be fast as they're connecting to information that's available in their game, which is going to a lot of times require them to move in various different lines. It's going to require them to move in different speeds and have different angles at which they come into a cut. What is it dependent on? The movement of others and the movement of themselves as they're continuing to move. So I just want to mention that, because that's a problem, obviously, in American football, and something that we were trying to delineate within the paper.
Yeah, I always use that. That's another example I always use is, people say, is this applied to all sports skills? And I say, yeah, but there's different degrees, right? There's different amount of variability in sprinting, which is lower end, versus an NFL running back, which needs an enormous amount of variability to be able to run successfully. Yeah. So, yeah. Shawn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I was just going to come in on the tail end. I think that's where the interesting anecdotes that we were able to share from arguably the greatest player to have ever played in Jerry Rice, where he really talked about football speed back in the 80s, because he was notoriously known for, at his pro day, not running all that fast on stopwatches, but yet obviously multiple Super Bowl most valuable player, and obviously a laundry list of records that he set without having speed in the traditional context. And then, of course, Bill Belichick, the most winningest Super Bowl coach of all time, coming in on the tail end of that and simply saying, like, football speed, little different than the rest of the speed in the way that we're measuring it here.
For sure.
So even though we know that that's obviously very, it can be interpreted a number of different ways, and we're kind of taking it out of context to a certain degree. I think we are applying it within context, because one is the best player to have ever played, and the other is arguably the greatest coach to have ever played. And they're saying similar things about the speed that is emerging on field, and that it obviously encompasses much, much more than just purely action capabilities.
For sure. Yeah. I think, we know this. You talk about athletes, running backs having great vision, and we know and but we don't kind of connect the dots sometimes. Shawn, do you want to talk a little bit about your example? The first one I could tell that was, that was yours. So that's why I got
not only because it was like 3,000 words, but also just because it was a lot of run-on.
This is what I write papers the same way. You get different people doing different parts, and
no, I definitely will speak to that. Yes, like Tyler mentioned earlier, I think he alluded to the fact that this is an athlete that has partnered with me now 12 years, almost 12 years at this point. But this was about midway through his journey, or our journey together, when I was making a transition from a more traditional approach to a more ecologically centered rationale. And what we found when we analyzed his movement behaviors in context were the various gaps that he had very limited strategies or solutions for solving similar movement behavior problems, right? That a lot of his early perception, and when I say early, I mean within his career, was oriented around what movement problem exists right in front of him. And he would have very limited, or he would lack abundance or degeneracy within his movement solutions to being able to solve that respective problem. So at defensive end in the National Football League, edge rusher coming off the line and trying and attempting to sack or bring down either the quarterback or maybe a running back or perform any number of different intentional aims as well. But mostly edge rushers in today's NFL are oriented around sacking the quarterback. That's where the money is made. But what I found when we started having these discussions and we were analyzing movement behavior in context was that he was very much centered on the behaviors of that immediate opponent that was in front of him, the left tackle, primarily because he plays off the right side of the defense. And so when we really started to look at where the gaps existed within his movement toolbox, the reason why it led me to reason like this was a major glaring gap that must be explored or then ultimately exploited was that when he would be facing quarterbacks who would have more exaggerated movement out of the pocket or even within the pocket, quarterbacks that were stepping up, moving quicker within the pocket, and quarterbacks who were very sensitive or attuned to how the pressure was maybe collapsing them in their movement behaviors and in what it was doing to their affordances, the affordances of the quarterback. I realized, like, wait a minute, here, year by year by year, the NFL performance landscape continues to be adopting a more athletic mover at the quarterback position. Guys like Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, and in particular, and now the one thing that people probably know who I'm referring to or talking about when we use this example, but just for ethics purposes, obviously we didn't put his name in there.
Yeah.
But against one of those respective quarterbacks that I just named was when the light bulb moment happened for me, when that quarterback escaped the pocket to the quarterback's left or the defensive end's right, and the defensive end used the speed move, one of his two go-to moves. He was really oriented around two moves, either a speed rush move around the edge or a bull rush move where you go right into the offensive tackle and attempt to push that guy back into the lap of the quarterback. He executed a speed rush move, and one of those quarterbacks that I just mentioned escaped the pocket outside the other way in the defensive end. And this was in a game that was late in the season. The defensive end never even picked him up until it was well too late, and that quarterback ends up scoring a touchdown. The team that my guy was on didn't actually make the playoffs because of this respective game. And we could point to some of these things as to why or maybe how or what we needed to do in the future in the offseason to try and attack this more multi-layered movement problem solving. And so now we added representativeness to the information that was present, that was channeling or guiding the movement that the player was coordinating. And we started, as I mentioned in the case study, we started to incorporate every single on-field session with a center with the ball. We realized that the ball, there are some programs across the country that say the ball is the program. In fact, one right down the road at the University of Minnesota, they talk about the ball being highly specifying. Like they'll use that kind of cliche idea, but the ball is specifying for a defensive player. In fact, there's a cliche that NFL defensive players say, like, don't make it so deep for me. It's like as simple as see ball, get ball. Like that's really where their focus and their attention is educated to. And so for the defensive end, it wasn't any longer only about the tackle's movement behaviors, even though that was highly specifying because behavior affords behavior and your immediate local movement problem and that immediate opponent is going to be highly specifying to what affordances you may have. But when the ball was snapped, how the ball was snapped, that combined with the quarterback's voice, his inflection, some of those things become these multiple sources of information that could potentially channel timing of action, what affordances, what options one may have, where you can act and how you can act based on each one of these bits of information, right? And it isn't so much a cue and an if this, then that type of nature that we would find in more traditional approaches. It's this landscape of affordances that were really highly relevant and pertinent based on the ball being in the center's hands, going to the quarterback in relation to the tackle's set, his pass set in his drop, and how or when the defensive end then could act. So once we gave him more exposure, we essentially saw Michaels and Jacobs' direct learning principle, education of attention, education of intention, and calibration, kind of come to life. Because as he interacted with some of these problems, and again, in a repetition without repetition fashion, where no two problems are ever the same, and we were changing opponents, it wasn't always the same left tackle, it wasn't always the same center, it wasn't always the same quarterback. So action capabilities and nuances of movement strategies were changing in each one of those parties, essentially day to day to day, or maybe even in some cases, rep to rep or series to series within our practice design. In the player himself, the defensive end, who already was a Pro Bowler, started to expand his movement toolbox dramatically. Like he started to get a spin move now off of that speed move. He started to be able to develop some chopping type of actions at his hands instead of just the bull rush where he was getting up into him. He started to execute a jab step. And I mentioned the spin move earlier. He even executed, and this happened in a playoff game then that following season, he executed a fake spin move, which I've probably seen maybe 5 times across any level of football, to where a guy is going to spin and then he comes back up out of it and leaves the guy standing, essentially grasping for air. So my point with all that is saying this, like what we displayed in the graphic or the illustration, is that it's this simultaneous and successive affordances that I wanted to offer him because of those key interacting component parts between center, tackle, and quarterback, and how each one of them are behaving in unison. Then that is guiding or channeling the movement behavior of the defensive end or any player across an 11v11 NFL football field or any football field for that matter.
Yeah, no, Shawn, I think that's a great example. I really like it's a great example of nested affordances to me, right? Yes. You know, getting by a defensive line and getting by the lineman if the quarterback's out of the pocket, that's achieved affordance of one affordance that's useless, right? You have to keep, and then they have, you know, I don't know, most people that don't know, if you don't know football, the defensive ends also have to keep their lane in case there's a running play. Like, it's more than just getting by this guy in front of you. Right. There's multiple things in I think you use the term, they interact non-linear. You cannot teach you how to bull rush and then add it to chasing down a quarterback. They all have to happen together. And that's where you come up with this, you know, the word you use, dexterity. Like, that's a great example of dexterity, that fake spin move, right? That's creative problem solving. Yeah. No, that's really cool.
Rob, one additional thing that's really important to mention, and I have no problem being the person that's humble here and saying, hey, I don't have all the answers, even as a coach that's been utilizing these ideas for a while. Upon the initial design of the activity that's shared there in the second case example, is we started a 1v1, maybe some 1v2 in open space. And yes, that was wildly beneficial because the changing spaces that were there between the players, the velocities that they're entering the space were going to be changing because they were changing the space there, and then they're changing the person that was entering the space. But that wasn't enough, because the players then expressed the need for them to be able to pick up other information that was going to channel how they were going to behave. So if we talk about the specifying information that's there, yes, if the ball carrier already has the ball in their hand, the way in which they're moving, the body orientation, the balls are all going to be largely specifying. Additionally, where they are on the field. But they said, like, Tyler, I may need to be in coverage, or I might need to occupy a particular space. I can't just start sprinting out to the open space thinking that the ball carrier may be there. So that was where we started to include a running back. We included offensive tackle, a defensive end, and a quarterback, to where the quarterback could run the ball, the quarterback could throw the ball, the running back could run the ball. That way they were having to pick up who had the ball and where their ball was. That way that they were behaving accordingly. That way their solution was functional versus it being, I just sprint to a space and I try to make a tackle. So it goes beyond the ability to pick up one's orientation and the speed at which they're moving in order for me to make the tackle. I have to pick up where someone's going to be in space before I can even get there. So that's where I had to say, like, what else would you include here that could increase the complexity or make it more game-like? And they said, well, Tyler, I need to pick up whether the running back's getting the ball and then what the quarterback's doing with it before I actually make the tackle. And I knew that but it was in that particular activity in that day. They said, this will make it way more useful for me because it'll make it to where I can make these tackles when I'm in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another good example of football agility or football speed, right? You can't just barrel head on into things. You have to pick you have affordance, you have goals, affordances that are not just. I just want to. I'm sure you have these in the other examples. I'm guessing, but both of your examples are defensive. And a skeptic might say, well, of course it works for defense. Defense is all reactive. And Can you talk a little bit, Shawn, about offensive side of things, applying this approach?
Yeah, and we did. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler. I think 2 out of our other 3 examples were offensive. And we just made the selection, obviously, to go in the direction that we did for various reasons. But much to your point, Rob, these ideas do live across positions, just like they live across sports, right? The relevance of them probably depends on one's intentional goals or aims to act in a given way, position by position. But in American football, obviously the problems are ever changing. They're dynamic. The movement problem solving is emergent, right? Mm-hmm. And it is going to be complex. It's interacting component parts, and it's 11 versus 11 in any respective time on an NFL football field. And for the offensive players, well, luckily my doctoral research is all oriented around NFL running backs. So I will have more, I will get closer to the truth on that offensive agility side from an evasive standpoint for people later on. But with the offensive players, what we find there is that an ecological approach is actually really fully embraced quicker for offensive players in my experience. And the reason is because we do prioritize a more athlete-centeredness, authenticity, autonomy, creativity. These aspects that allow the player to maybe honestly express themselves within the movement problem that they're facing. So when they have a ball in their hands and they're trying to achieve a certain practical goal or purpose, they're trying to organize a more functional movement solution. Really, it all comes down to then it being able to find the most dexterous movement solution, the problem to the problems in the world. So across situations and across conditions. And again, no 2 problems are ever the same. So really, whether you're on defense or offense, Bernstein's idea of dexterity, the ability to solve any emerging movement problem under any situation and condition, applies across positions. And it maybe, and this is a bias that is often offered at me, where the finger gets pointed at me on Football Beyond the Stats when I do my weekly movement plays of the week. Often they're of offensive players, right? So unless a defensive player is creating or causing a turnover and then doing something special with the ball in their hands afterwards, it often is a running back or a wide receiver, maybe a quarterback in space who's doing something crazy and novel that I give my movement play of the week to. And it's for those reasons that I just mentioned, that oftentimes we do get to see the movement qualities and characteristics expressed that are creative, authentic, that have abundance to them. We see these novel movement strategies or solutions often emerge for the offensive players. And we see it emerge, and Tyler can attest to this, out in the practice field as well, out in the learning environment. Because if you give that player the solution space to explore that perceptual motor workspace, those problem and solution dynamics, they do become so sensitive and so open and so responsive and so adaptable around what behaviors are unfolding for other players, as well as what certain affordances or opportunities for action exist within the world for them. You know, what gaps afford passability or run through ability, what defenders in a position of the defenders might mean for the evasiveness or the strategy that they might coordinate or select. You know, you start to see crazy stuff. And again, Tyler can attest to this fact, because I've seen videos of some of the players he partners with in training environments too, where you're not even like asking them to do certain things, but because the offensive players want to thrive there, they almost turn into like backyard football players to a certain degree. You'll see them hurdling guys in the training environment. You're like, whoa, I never expected that was going to unfold. Like, we could never repeat that in a decontextualized fashion in a learning environment that lacks aliveness, that is more decontextualized or isolated. Like, it just never would emerge without that alive movement problem that actually has opponents that are living, breathing, and changing their movement, and then giving the permission or autonomy over to the player. As Tyler says, invite the player to their own party. Like, you allow them to have the space to go authentically, honestly create with the movement solutions to the problems that they're facing.
Yeah, I like that, Shawn. I like the, flipping the idea of plays on offense from solutions of here's what you do to they're just an instructional, they're a constraint. They're another, we're going to run left. Within that, you have a whole bunch of room to find your own movement solution. I think changing that way of thinking, I think, is really important. It's not to say, it doesn't. Yeah, Shawn, do you want to?
I was just going to jump in with a funny tidbit or a funny story there. Actually, the player who was the participant or the person who was the individual we talked about within the paper is now coaching his kids in football. Oh. And so the kids are 6 years old, 8 years old, and 10 years old. And he coaches all three teams. And even with the 10-year-old, because of that, what he learned from an ecological approach, the player himself is adopting an ecological approach, much to the point that you made. So this just becomes another funny anecdote to a certain degree. I talked to him a couple of weeks ago as he was starting to implement the playbook for these kids. And now, again, some of them are young, but the 10-year-old, they've been playing flag football at least for a number of years now. And he puts in the playbook, it's a run left or a run right. Like, we're talking about an NFL football player who is dumbing it down, the tactics down to a level that it's just like, go this way or go that way. Everyone basically go solve the movement problem that's in front of them. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, the fortunate part is that you have three, young athletes that have a father who plays in the National Football League. So they might be a little bit more gifted than the rest of the players on the field. Mm-hmm. But when they go left or they go right, I can damn well promise you they're making some people miss. And they're developing and acquiring that football specific skill that we were just referring to. So just a kind of a funny side story there.
Yeah, I know. It reminds me of the pickup football game, get open. That used to be the play we'd run. It was so useful. Tyler, did you want to throw it in?
Well, two things. Number one, I want to mention something on the tail end of that comment. In the idea of just get open, think about what players are able to do. They're able to be creative. They're able to run routes in different ways. They're able to utilize their movement to create space off of the route that they're running, or utilizing the body position to have a more creative catch at catch point. Mm-hmm. And do we actually allow for our athletes to behave in that way now? Or are we telling them how they need to set up, the speed at which they need to run, how they need to create separation? And the same can be said for the defensive back. You need to turn your hips this way. It's all the stuff that is just the copious amounts of information that are shared to an athlete, even after we told them exactly what they need to do, is hindering and stripping, in my humble opinion, their creativity on the field. But yet we love creativity, and we love to see this expression of dexterity in context across sports. But how that dexterity comes to be is by allowing athletes to be uniquely themselves and to move in ways that are going to be unique to them. And that only comes to be whenever they're embedded in environments that are going to be alive, and that they don't get, slapped whenever they're, their hands slapped whenever they're behaving in ways that are not what they were taught. The only thing I was going to mention, and I'm not surprised that you picked up the fact that there were two defensive case examples there. We did have five. We had another defensive case example. It was actually another linebacker example, but it was tackles in traffic. So making tackles in traffic and making tackles in open space, because those are going to be very different, especially with the information that one's picking up whenever there's all those bodies at the line. But we did have a quarterback example and a tight end example as well. So the reason why we ended up with the two that we have, that was the case example number 2 in this particular paper was the longer of the other ones. The other ones were in the ballpark of probably 500 to 600 words. So whenever we look to remove 3 case examples, it's like, okay, we can take out about 1,600 words here and then take these 3 away. And then we'll leave the second case example, which was a tiny bit longer. That way it gives readers a little bit more to go on, but we'll include those in subsequent papers.
Yeah, I think I was going to pick up on the tight end and also the get open example. I think, because football is a team sport, the opportunity to develop shared affordances, right? A quarterback get open play, a quarterback has to look down the field and see, okay, that if he goes there, he's going to be open. And that's the idea of shared affordances. Same with a tight end when you're blocking, right? Have to both read the defensive plays together, and you can't talk to each other and say, you got him, I got, it's picking up the same information at the same time and acting on it. And so I think, a lot of what you're describing gives those opportunities as well. I guess we'll just wrap it up, guys. Maybe a last I get from you both, I know, if you're a coach, you coach reads this and they do, I want to try some of these ideas. Where do you start with? Obviously emergence is a great place to start. I cannot highlight more the benefit of talking through these things with other coaches and going bouncing around. That's one of the best ways you can get into this stuff. But do you have any other things you would say? Maybe Shawn, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I'll jump in with obviously a theme that probably is threaded throughout many of my answers, which would just be look to inject more alive movement problems into your practice first and foremost. You probably heard the rhetoric or saw or read the rhetoric within the paper where we talk about what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it unfold like? What does it, hear? What are the players picking up? Are we able to keep perceptions and actions coupled? Are we able to keep the problem and the respect on it with the player connecting to that peculiar problem? And I think the more individuals get to that point where they can wrap their head around that alive nature, and I don't care if we're talking about American football or the example that you used earlier with track and field. Aliveness exists everywhere, just at varying intensities and levels and with different levels of complexity, right? So I think first and foremost, my call to action for the community or anyone listening to this would be look to inject more aliveness and then start to see how your players or your athletes behave differently and what else you can do to kind of open up the bandwidth of that aliveness. What other qualities or characteristics or sources of information might that athlete need to connect to that they haven't been connecting to prior to this point?
Yeah. I like that word. Is that Bruce Lee? Well, yeah. I like the word alive.
Yeah, I should have given credit where credit was due there. Sure.
I like alive a lot because it captures so much, not only of the actual information and task, but how people, the life that comes out of people when they practice that way, the way they talk and how loud they are and, how much fun they have. So, yeah. Tyler, do you have any, comments as well?
Yeah, I think movement is more vibrant whenever one's interacting with alive problems. And if we think about the nature of someone being creative, we want someone that is going to be moving in vibrant ways, and they need to connect with those problems that are alive. And I love the idea. I'd actually never heard of it before. I heard Shawn use it. I started getting into Bruce Lee more, and I was like, oh, this is the only other place I've ever seen this. And so he's just, harnessing that idea and injecting it into team sports. I love the one that you mentioned, Rob, as far as talking to other coaches. I think that has huge merit. I cannot express enough how important it is, but to do it in a safe environment. I say a safe environment, meaning like there are too many times where it's like, well, I'm going to be protective of my ideas or your ideas are wrong. And we have almost like this, our cup is full. If we're going to use another example from Bruce Lee, like empty your mind, empty your cup, like come into the situation where you are ready to receive something, ready to connect and potentially admit that maybe the way that you've been doing something isn't the best that it can be. But I think for me, there are really twofold. Number one, watch the sport itself and then look at or watch your practice activities when you're not the one that's running one. Like maybe you've helped set it up and other coaches are running the activities, and ask yourself, does this look like the sport? Not only does this in general, do the behaviors of the athletes look like they look whenever they're moving in the game? And you have to be ready to answer yourself honestly. So I think that's a really powerful place to start. And that's not just in American football. That's in soccer. That's in futsal. That's in baseball. Like, does this look like the sport? If I'm hitting off of a pitching machine or if I am hitting off of a tee, yes, maybe the swing looks somewhat like it, but where are their eyes? Is the ball moving? Is that helpful if the ball moves? Well, I'd say so if the pitcher's the one that's throwing it. So you can kind of see where I'm going here. Like, does their movement, the complete movement problem solving process, so not just their actions, but the way that they're aiming to interact, where their perceptions are, what they're picking up, where their vision is, so on and so forth. I'd say that's a big one for me. Like, how are they behaving? And ask yourself the honest question when watching your athletes move. And if the answer is no, well, then we might need to go back to the drawing board. And that's where I had to answer the hard question for myself. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up adopting an ecological approach to practice design and using a CLA within practice. The second one is this, and this has probably been the most powerful for me after I had to answer that hard question that I asked myself. Involving athletes. Shawn mentioned inviting the athlete to their own party. That's a big one for me because I fortunately have had an opportunity to work with a number of different sports in my career. I've spent the most time in American football, and I only spend my time in football now, but I've worked with a lot of sports. Well, guess what? I'm not the best learning designer for every single sport. So I had to then go, well, what do you think about this? How would you increase the complexity here? Hey, Johnny, your homework for tonight is to take the activity that we utilize today, and I want you to tweak it in some way. I want you to either make it more difficult, less difficult, and then we're going to try it, and then we're going to likely manipulate constraints within practice. So for the listeners out there, they're like, well, gosh, you're using a lot of big words. I actually talk to my athletes about how this approach is likely going to be very different than what you've engaged with before. And I'm also going to involve you in the process because the way in which you're going to behave is going to be largely dependent on what you're picking up and how you're able to move. So I'm going to lean on you to help design a lot of these activities. And that's hard for coaches. So I think coaches need to realize that we are still very, very valuable to the learners that are trying to solve problems, even whenever we're vulnerable and we ask them, what might you change here? Mm-hmm. So I would say representative co-design.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. The other point I would make, so I think reading, even if you're not a football coach, reading these examples, like I recommend the Renshaw Ecological Approach to Golf Coaching book to every coach I work with, because going through the logic of the constraints-led approach, even if it's not your same sport, is so valuable. I think you see, so that you guys did a great job. That's why if you get the paper, the examples are like multiple pages, right? Your case examples are not like do this and then let it run, right? You connect it to all the concepts. And I think that's for you to go off and be able to do this on your own, eventually at a high level, you need to be able to do that. And these papers, all these different sports, I think are so valuable, different ones. And I'm glad they're doing these. Yeah.
Rob, I want to mention one more thing because that's an extremely valuable comment. With the paper itself, one thing we didn't mention, and we've had a lot of people ask us this question, like this is a big paper. This takes a long time to read. Why did you write so much theory? Or another way they've asked it is, why didn't you give us more case examples? I mentioned that already, as did Shawn. We felt as though that this might be the first paper that a football coach ever engages with. Mm-hmm. And if they have zero background on an ecological approach to learning, we wanted to at least offer what the framework looks like, and then what vehicle might be able to be used that they can then harness and utilize in their own practice. But then we knew we had to give them really usable examples. So I think that's a really valuable add, because one thing that we do here with one of the projects that we offer called the Movement Academy is we frequently will challenge coaches from their sport to look outside of their sport and go have conversations about the other person's sport. So not only reading about it, but I want you to go talk with a handball coach, and I want you to ask them about why they design the activities the way that they do and what opportunities might be available for you to then absorb that you could then inject into your practice. So I just wanted to add on to that, because that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, I think it's really, you can learn so much from across different sports. So I think I'll wrap it up there, guys. So the paper is in the journal Sports Coaching Review. I think I saw it's open access. You guys made it now?
It wasn't initially, and we realized after getting a lot of messages that, oh man, we're gonna have to bite the bullet and pay. And so we did. We on behalf of Emergence, we made the paper open access.
Oh,
so
nice.
Yes, it's in a Sports Coaching Review, and Emergence is to thank. So our other business partners as well, that it is available, and it's available for open access. Yeah.
Yeah. So good. Yeah, I know that's at least you don't have to pay the nature open access fees or anything, but still it's a little bit of a bite, isn't it? But yeah, no, I appreciate, you're right. I think this will be especially football itself. There's not a lot of research papers at all on American football to begin with. So you're right. I think this will be an entry point for a lot of people. So thanks for joining me, guys, as always. And everyone, the link to the paper in the notes, and check it out. Football coach or not, I think it's really, really useful. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.